In this module, we'll begin with an overview of autism. These will be things that kids with autism either do too much of or not enough of. And we'll talk about these within the context of how they impede learning, interaction, socialization, a kid's ability to perform with instructors. There are generally three things that impede a kid's ability with autism to learn new things. These include two deficits: language deficits, social deficits, and excesses, behavioral excesses like tantruming, crying, and screaming. So let's talk about the language piece of that. There are several components that make up the language that a child with autism uses. And one of the impediments that children often experience relates to their verbal behavior or their verbal communication with other people. In one of the other modules, we'll talk about verbal communication or the verbal behavior that kids use and how they use that, whether it's speaking or sign language or a picture exchange or a device. These are all verbal communicative behaviors, but only the speaking part is vocal. And we'll talk about that in more detail in another module. Kids with autism often have trouble with this expressive language use, with exhibiting verbal behavior to interact with other people. A second component related to that language is a kid's receptive language ability, his or her ability to understand what other people are saying. This is comprehension. If I speak to a kid and he understands what I'm saying, this is receptive language. He comprehends my words, even if he or she can't express those words. Another component of that language often relates to echolalia, or repeating back what other people have said. In some circumstances, this is immediate. So if I said, "What is this?" a kid with autism might just repeat back, "What is this?" often imitating my tone and rhythm and volume instead of answering the question. Or in other circumstances, it might be more delayed. So for example, a kid with autism might hear favorite lines or sounds from a movie or things that people have said and repeat them back at a later time. So how does that differ from what typically developing kids might do? Well, all children, as a part of typical language development, will exhibit some echolalic behavior. They will repeat back things that they've heard other people say. For kids with autism, it often interferes with their learning and socialization because it often occurs out of context and not as a part of interacting with other people. So for example, you might be at the zoo with a typically developing student and he or she might repeat back what you say. So if I saw a lion, I might say, "Whoa, look, a lion," and the kid might repeat "lion." Well, that's a part of an interaction with me and it's in context. When I exhibit echolalic behavior as a student with autism, it's often out of context and not as a part of interacting with other people. It can also interfere with learning insofar as it takes my attention as a kid with autism. So I might be so into my echolalic behavior that I'm not willing to attend, respond, and interact with you trying to instruct me. Another component of the language that often interferes with our kids relates to prosody, the way that I communicate with other people aside from just the words that I use. So these might include things like pitch, stress, volume, rhythm. I communicate with other people using these things even when I have the same words. So for example, I might say, "Oh, we're going to the zoo today." That means something different to most people than if I said, "Oh, we're going to the zoo today." Most people understand that in the former, I wasn't sure about which day we were going, and in the latter, I wasn't sure about where we were going. This communicates information to other people even though the words are the same. And children with autism often have difficulty understanding those differences and using those differences. We have a tendency to try and communicate more information with volume, but in and of itself, that's difficult for kids with autism. The last component related to the language is a kid's ability to use it as a part of conversations with other people. So a child with autism may have the ability to use language to label and request and answer questions, but can he or she carry on conversations with others? This is typically dictated by one or a combination of the following three things: interest, language ability, and flexibility. So related to the interest, a kid with autism may have the ability to use language to have conversation, but not the motivation to do so. He or she might not be interested in carrying on that conversation. So for example, a kid with autism may be interested in antique fans or antique radios or remote control cars and be willing to carry on conversations about those topics for long periods of time. But often peers are not motivated to do that. And the things that peers want to talk about may not be motivating to children with autism, and that will interfere with their ability to have a conversation. And with regard to the language abilities, obviously if I don't have much language, I can't have conversations with peers. If I don't have a broad repertoire of words and ways in which to use them, I won't be able to carry on conversations with other people. So with regard to the flexibility, even if a kid with autism has the interest and the language abilities to have conversations, he or she may not have the ability to maintain them over time. So many of our conversations begin with a handful of scripts. There are just a few ways in which we begin conversations. Where are you from? Where do you live? What do you do? After that, they go in any number of different directions, and you or I need to be flexible with regard to what direction those go in. Children with autism have a problem with the flexibility of maintaining the conversation. So the further we get from those initial scripts, the more difficult it's going to be for a kid with autism. So those language issues are often an area of deficit for children with autism. Another impediment to learning or area of deficit for children with autism often relates to social skills. One component of those social deficits often relates to a kid's nonverbal behavior. The way that we communicate with gestures, eye contact, facial expressions, these are things that children with autism often struggle to understand and struggle to use. One of the other components of a social skills deficit for a child with autism often relates to peer relationships, his or her ability to interact with same age or similar age peers. This is often the result of one or a combination of the following two things: the child's abilities related to language and his or her learning history with other kids and with adults. With regard to the language, if a child with autism has a smaller repertoire of language than his or her peer, it will be difficult to interact. And secondly, a kid's learning history will affect whether or not he or she can interact with peers and how often he or she does so. So for example, when I've interacted with adults in the past, how has that been functional for me? What value have I gotten for that? Most kids with autism have many interactions with adults that result in reinforcement. And many kids with autism have interactions with other kids that don't result in reinforcement. Other 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds may not have what this kid with autism wants. And that learning history reduces the likelihood that this kid with autism will initiate and respond to interactions of other children. Another component of those social deficits often relates to sharing achievements, enjoyment, experiences with other people. This is often referred to as joint attention. And there are several different behavioral components of joint attention. These include pointing, eye gaze, and the language that I use. Pointing is a joint attention behavior because I'm drawing someone else's experience to mine. When I point at things, I'm sharing my experience with someone else. And many children with autism have difficulty with this. I don't point when I'm alone. It's a social behavior that I do with other people. Children with autism often don't do this, and in fact, it's one of the early indicators of autism. So typically developing children will often start pointing at things on their own without specific instruction because they engage in joint attentive behaviors. Eye gaze, or shifting my eye gaze, is another joint attention behavior. You'll often see children who are developing typically shift their eye gaze in response to novel stimuli. So if something really good or really bad happens, those children will often turn to see how others respond or react to that stimulus. Children with autism often don't engage in those sorts of behaviors.